Hi, my name is Ashley Jolin, and today we are going to be looking at the ethics surrounding captivities in zoos and wildlife centers. Before we start diving in, it's important to realize why this topic is important. So, obviously, humans are not the only species living on this planet. We have hundreds of thousands of other species, including plants and animals, and yet humans tend to think that they are the top tier or the most important species that is to live on this earth. And this superiority complex is known as speciesism. It's also important to realize just how controversial zoos truly are. Oftentimes, you're either pro-zoo or anti-zoo, and there seems to be no middle ground. Zoos are known as a place for our enjoyment. It's where we can see animals in enclosures that aren't actually their native habitats, and they aren't given the right to roam freely like they were given when they were brought onto this earth. With that being said, zoos aren't the most horrible thing on the planet. In fact, some zoos are considered to be a stepping stone in rehabilitation and conservation of endangered species, which is really important. Now, all of this leads to many questions, some of which are: is that enough to allow the captivity of wild animals to occur? How much human interference is too much in regards to the animal's freedom? Is there truly a difference between good and bad zoos? And those are the questions that I am going to try to cover today. It's important to start at the beginning of zoos in order to see the growth that has been occurring throughout the years. The first zoos were actually collections of animals to show status of wealthy people, also known as menageries, and it goes back to as early as 2500 BCE. Modern zoos only became popular in the 18th century and were often used for science and enlightenment. The first zoo opened up in 1793 in Paris, and it's still in operation today. Now, these zoos were a lot different than the ones we know now. They had very small display areas that did not resemble the animal's habitat, and they were crowded with different species just crammed together, as you can see in this picture here. You can also see that they are on concrete floors, which we will learn later can really hurt the animals. Now, how have zoos grown throughout history? As time has progressed, zoos have started to have a conservation and research approach, where it's less about showing the animals as a spectation, but more so teaching the public about these animals and about either their endangered species or their disruption of habitats that are occurring. Cages that were concrete floors have been transformed into enclosures that mimic the species' habitat, with actual grass oftentimes outside. The majority of animals have increased space, though it is worth noting that it's not as much as they would have in the wild. But even with all the natural enclosures, the conservation efforts, and the research campaigns for these animals, zoos are still under the spotlight for being unethical. There are effects that can happen to the animals in captivity. These can both be physical or psychological, including depression, behavioral issues, and stress, and wounds from artificial sceneries and enclosures. This could be from fake rocks or fake foliage that can scrape or harm the animal. It's also important to realize that animals that were raised captive do not survive in the wild if they are released, because they are not used to being in the wild and relying on their natural instincts. They don't have to deal with the same things that they would in the wild that they do when they're in a zoo. Now, why is it that humans feel that they have the power to dictate another animal's life? Humans have a superiority complex, making us feel like we are the leader of every single species on Earth because of what we can accomplish, such as civilizations and industries and everything that we do. Humans use animals and other living beings for entertainment purposes because they can. Since animals can't speak, it's so easy to assume that they don't care what goes on in their lives. But studies show that animals are far more intelligent than we give them credit for. Now let's look at some of the positives that zoos has on animals. one of which being conservation efforts and rebuilding populations of endangered species, such as buffaloes, a bird called the baleo, and cottontail rabbits. This also brings conservation education to the public in a very palatable form where they're able to learn. Another area in which zoos are helping animals is through habitat protection and restoration for species recovery in the wild. An example of this would be Ashboro Zoo having a plot of longleaf pine where they're restoring the ecosystem to bring back the great biodiversity that it has. Zoos are also conducting research on different species and the effects the environment has on them. For example, there's been research conducted on whales and their reproductive issues due to the changing environment and pollution, and they're trying to find ways to build up the viability of these pregnancies for the whales. Animal rights is defined as the right animals are given to be free from any harm, abuse, or exploitation from the hands of humans. Speciesism is described as the mistreatment or exploitation of animals for the benefits of humans. It's my opinion that non-human animals should be viewed in the same light as humans. An interesting quote that came from the book called Ethics on the Ark, Zoos, Animal Welfare, and Wildlife Conservation. It's, quote, morally irrelevant to insist that zoos provide important educational and recreational opportunities for humans, end quote. This quote really stuck out to me because it emphasized the fact that we shouldn't be praising zoos for what they do for humans. We should be praising zoos for what they do for the animals they have and the steps they're taking to support and help these animals thrive in both their zoos and in the wildlife populations. There are circumstances where captivity is generally accepted, and that is when the habitat of the animals are in harm's way, and so people would take the animals, and that is considered morally okay. Environmental ethics refers to preserving ecosystems and providing help through interventions to save these ecosystems when needed. There are multiple theories to work towards positive environmental change, some of which being deep ecology, social ecology, and ecofeminism. One of the most liked theories is compassionate conservation, meaning that you are combining conservation and animal welfare together. Zoos in their original state do not act in compassionate conservation, as they were mostly human-centered and not focused on the animal's well-being. They must leave their purely entertainment past behind and become focused on conservation in order to make a positive difference. And some zoos, such as the Detroit Zoo, have been aiming to be better, and we will look at some examples of how the Detroit Zoo has changed in the next clip. The clip shown is a great representation of how zoos used to operate versus the new perspective people have on how animals should be treated today. Before, the elephants were in those tiny cages with concrete floors that were hurting them, and now they're in natural-like enclosures where they're able to thrive and be elephants. It was also noted that at the beginning, zoos were primarily made for profit and for the people and not for the animals, but you can see how that's changed throughout time. It gives insight on how some zoos acknowledge their past and they are learning from it and growing and becoming better to become a conservation zoo. In conclusion, it's clear to see that the ethics of zoos is not one-sided, and thankfully they are becoming better for the animals as time goes on. In some ways, humans are responsible for restoring the habitats that we have destroyed through human actions, and zoos are working towards this goal. The focus of zoos are shifting more towards animals and less for humans, which is reducing the speciesism stigma that zoos have. There are still issues regarding zoos, such as the question of should animals be able to free roam versus being held in captivity. But the evidence shows that the statement of them being flat out unethical is no longer warranted compared to earlier zoos. Today, zoos are working for the animals and trying to restore habitats and restore populations of endangered species. They're not just using them flat out for money, like earlier zoos were. With everything we have learned, I think it's clear to see that there is truly a difference between good and bad zoos. Zoos will continue to be a topic of conversation, but it's important to recognize the growth that zoos have made and give them credit to where it's due. Even though this is a controversial subject, there is no right answer, but I do think that zoos are not as unethical as some people make them out to be. Thank you so much for listening to my presentation on the ethics surrounding captivity in zoos and wildlife centers, and I hope you learned something new today.